Welcome back! I'm making spoons again, like last time, but different. Very different, actually. You'll see why. The reason I'm circling back to spoons isn't because I'm morally opposed to buying silverware and I'm hell-bent on making my own, but because one of my good friends just started her own small business, and she wanted to know if I would be able to make a few for her so that she doesn't have to buy them from somewhere else. Which, yes, I would love to. I love supporting small businesses in general, but especially if it's a friend's business. The catch is, in order for her to have inventory, I have to make a bunch of them. And if it turns out that there's a high demand, I'll have to make even more. So I'll have to find a way to streamline this process a bit because if I have to spend an hour plus shaping and sanding each individual spoon, my arms are going to fall off. So this video is not about the individual spoon making, but rather that streamlining process and me trying to figure it out. But first, I'm going to start with just one, figure out the dimensions and the size, and then see where I can make improvements to my approach from there. As always, I started with a rough sketch of how I want the spoon to look, and I drew that out on a scrap piece of African mahogany. I've talked about this before in previous videos, but when making things that will come into contact with food, you can't just use any wood. You want to make sure to use a non-porous hardwood. This is because food juices and particles can get inside of the porous woods and become a breeding ground for bacteria, which, when that happens, there's no cleaning it out. You just have to throw the whole thing away because it will start to rot and mold and be not safe for use. African mahogany is pretty common for use around food because it meets those criteria. It's a pretty dense hardwood. And it's also really, really pretty when you get to finish on there. So for now, I'll be making all of her spoons out of that. All right, I got the little chunk with my spoon sketch cut out. And now the fun begins. I can slowly start cutting it out and refining the shape. In the past, I've done this by using the bandsaw, which wasn't ideal because the blade is way too thick to handle the curves. Which is why in my last video, I decided that I was going to buy a scroll saw if I decided I really, really needed it. I think I'm giving myself 5 projects where I have to make these kinds of cuts using the bandsaw before I convince myself that I need this purchase. Well, I didn't wait for 5 projects. I actually didn't wait at all. I got this 2 days later because I lack self-control. But, in my defense, I got it used and it was like $10, so don't be mad at me. It was a good deal. Now, I didn't get a chance to really test it out since I bought it. I cleaned it up a bit and made sure that it works, but that's about it. So this will be my real first time actually using it. I did decide to cut out the handle on the bandsaw first because that part is pretty straight and that's going to be way easier to do on this machine. And then when that's done, I'll be cutting the curved parts on the scroll saw, because that's what that's for. Anytime I'm cutting out shapes on the bandsaw, I like to do those little notches on the side that I usually do, because that way it cuts in parts, and it gives me an easy exit point in case I ever need to stop midway through the cut. I'm not really a fan of pulling out the piece in reverse in case I need to stop midway, because I have had an instance where the blade wasn't on a spinning mechanism properly, and when I pulled out the piece, it pulled the blade back with it, and it slipped off the mechanism while it was spinning. And while that's pretty harmless because there's this entire enclosure that prevents the blade from coming out at you, it still makes a really not fun sound in the process, so I try to avoid repeating that entire experience, so I would rather just have an exit point that prevents me from having to pull it in reverse. Okay, now that we have the handle cut out, it's time for the scroll saw. When I say that I haven't used the scroll saw before, I don't just mean that I haven't used this one before. I meant that I've never used one ever. A part of me knows that I probably should have tested this out on a few scraps first and gotten the feel for the tool, but we all know that's not how I operate. I'll jump in with both of my feet first, make a mistake, and then spend the next hour trying to fix what I could have avoided entirely. And that's the kind of direction in which this was heading. You don't even need to see my face to know that the cutting process wasn't going as smoothly as I had hoped. To be fair, the material that I was cutting was pretty dense, and on top of that, the piece itself was also really thick. So I imagined that it would take a bit of effort to cut through. But that's not what made it difficult. The way that a scroll saw works is a bit different than a bandsaw, and that's because the bandsaw blade just moves in one direction from the frame of reference of the piece that you're cutting. So it just cuts in a downward motion. The scroll saw cuts up and down, so that makes it feel like the piece is vibrating, and because of that, it requires more effort to hold steady. Because of this, my hand was getting pretty numb as I was trying to hold this thing down, and because of the way that the piece was vibrating because of the blade, it was really tough to see exactly where I drew the line that I was supposed to be following during this cut. So I made peace with the fact that I probably won't be able to cut exactly on the line as I hoped, and I exited out of my cut to give my hands a little bit of time to rest before I figured out how I'm gonna approach this next. Before you ask, I did also play around with the speed settings, and it helped a little bit, but not enough to really make a difference. After I got the feeling back in my fingers, I did give it another shot, and it did go way better than last time, so that does make me think that some of the problems I had was maybe because of my inexperience with the tool. But I still do think that cutting something this thick and getting the lines to be perfectly exact and smooth might be a little bit unrealistic. So that's gonna be a problem for me. I will say though, I do appreciate how the scroll saw doesn't leave burn marks like the bandsaw did. These edges feel really nice to the touch, so I guess it has that going for it. But next, I threw the spoon on my belt sander so that I could shape it a little bit more before I started carving out the details. Then I grabbed my trusty Dremel and the sanding bits, and I went at it. I actually kept switching between the Dremel and the sander as I was doing this. I kept carving out the curves that I wanted, and then when I got to a patch that looked like it could use something more aggressive, I threw it on the belt sander. This is where it gets different from my last spoon, and where I hoped my life would be easier. I couldn't find the real bits that are normally used for spoon carving. They're big and circular, but I guess not super common in hardware stores, so I grabbed these metal ones instead. My hope had been that they would be aggressive enough to carve the curvature of the inside of the spoon a lot more efficiently than the combination of bits I used last time. They had not. It was still so time-consuming, and you can tell that around this point is where I was making peace with the fact that this approach wasn't sustainable and that I wouldn't be able to make the spoons by hand. At least not if they were to be sold at a reasonable price, because this was taking up just too much time and effort to get done. So I decided to finish up this one spoon as much as I could, which means bring it to the first point at which it becomes usable, but not spend much more time trying to refine it past that, and then go to plan B and see if I can make that work out a little better. For plan B, I had my shopmate help me out actually, because he studied design and knows his way around CAD software way better than I do, so he took the measurements for my handmade spoon and made a file for me that I can then throw onto the CNC. This is my go-to life hack right here. You don't have to be good at things, as long as you have friends that are good at things. And my friends being good at things has gotten me out of so many messes in my life that I usually get myself into by trying to do projects that I'm just not equipped to handle. Like, for example, this one. This is what the file that he made looks like. You can see these little tabs that are connecting all of the spoons together. Those are necessary because once the spoon is cut out, if it's not somehow attached, it'll just get flung off the table by the spinning bit. So there needs to be something holding it in place so that I can break it off later, but it needs to remain attached during the drilling process until it's finished. Then I use the double-sided tape to tape the entire piece that I'll be using to the table so that doesn't fly off either. And then I pick out the bits that I'll be using, the first one for hollowing out the inside of the spoon and the second one for cutting out the shape. I calibrated the CNC. And then I push the button and I let it do its thing. Before we decided that I'm going to make these spoons for her, my friend was originally going to buy them wholesale from somewhere else. There are a bunch of places online where you can buy things like this and then resell them, but after looking at what's available, we had some concerns. The main issue obviously being the quality. From everything we saw, it looked like the people who were selling wholesale were also buying those things wholesale from somewhere else. So these spoons that she would be getting are already once removed from the original maker. So she would be the third round of wholesalers. So in order for the price to be as reasonable as it was by the time it got to her, then it's really hard to trust that the quality would be good to begin with, right? And this was a pretty big concern for her because this isn't just some knick-knack that would be sitting on a counter. It's something that's going to interact with her customers' food. If the finished use for these spoons isn't food safe, or if it has lead in it or something like that, then whatever is on the item is going to get into the tea and the customer would be consuming it. So this can be really bad if it's not done properly. I talked about this before in my previous videos, both with the spoon that I made and the one where I went over food safe finishes, and I'll make sure to link them both below, but you have to be way more careful with how you finish products that are going to interact with food. This teaspoon really can't have anything toxic in it because hot liquid is one of the ultimate tests for finishes. Whatever is on the spoon will slowly dissolve into the hot liquid over time. So it's super important that whatever we use is 100% safe for consumption. This is why she decided not to risk going with a different seller and to just have them made by someone she knows and trusts. That way she knows everything that went into this and she can feel comfortable selling it to her customers. Speaking of wholesalers, after my friend and I flipped through the wholesaler sites, I saw a couple of Etsy sellers that have these same items that they clearly got from the wholesalers, and they're listing them as quote-unquote handmade and upcharging like 10 times the price. They didn't even take their own pictures of the items. They just literally copy-pasted the pictures that the wholesalers are using. Which I feel is super shady because they should disclose that it's not handmade if it's bought from somewhere else. But that's a rant for another video. I'm gonna leave that alone for now. Back to the spoons. This is how it looks cut out. As you can see at the top, I didn't measure correctly where the top spoon goes and where the material ends, so whoops. But that's okay. Now I can just break off each spoon and see what I'm working with. It was already so much easier getting to this point than it was with a handmade spoon. This process feels way more promising already. Now I grab a chisel and I get rid of the parts where the tabs used to be that are still sticking out. This just makes it so that I have less work to do when I start sanding. For once, my tool was sharp and they came off pretty easily. Then I grabbed my Dremel and again, I started sanding. This time, the process wasn't that bad. The amount of sanding that I had to do for these 4 spoons was significantly less than I had to do for a single handmade one. It still took a bit of patience, but overall it wasn't anything unreasonable. I could definitely sit down in a day and make a bunch of these for her, and then if the stock gets low, I could set aside another day and make a bunch more. So bottom line here is, it looks like technology sometimes makes your life easier. Who knew? Alright. Everybody's nice and sanded. Let's compare. Well, I say compare, but I don't think it's much of a comparison. For one, I gave up on the handmade one before it was fully finished, but even if I did finish it, it wasn't going to be able to stand up to these. They're way sleeker looking, which I like, and they're also consistent. With the handmade one, even if I had unlimited time and patience, I wouldn't be able to get this level of consistency. They are also pretty shallow as far as spoons go, but that's because they are teaspoons, so they're mostly used for stirring and picking out random tea leaves from the pot. I did plan on getting rid of these swirlies on the inside that are from the CNC bit path, but she said that she actually likes it because it looks like an intentional design, almost like a little fingerprint. Okay, now the main part. The reason I'm making these rather than just buying them in bulk. The finish. Our options were butcher block oil or tung oil. Both are great and go-tos for food-safe finishes, but I wanted to do tung oil because that one is more durable and you don't need to reapply it as often. Durability is important here because we don't want our customers to buy something and then have the finish wear off after a few uses and turn into junk. We want this to last as long as possible without needing a reapplication. I got my Milk Paint brand tung oil and their citrus solvent, which are my favorite out of all of the brands that I have tried. And no, this is not sponsored by them, by the way. I really wish it were, but I kind of trashed their paint in one of my previous videos, so I don't think I'll be hearing from them anytime soon for a sponsorship. And then I also got a container in which I can dunk the spoons in. Because I plan on putting these spoons in an oil bath and letting the oil absorb all the way in, I used a 1-to-1 ratio of oil to solvent. I actually used even a little bit more solvent than oil, and this is because tung oil is kind of thick and hard to work with. Cutting it down with the solvent thins it out and makes it so it's actually able to get absorbed way further into the wood than it would be if it was just pure. And this also then allows it to dry faster. I will also say, while on the topic of solvents, be careful with what kind of container you use for the oil bath because this is a really good solvent. As in, it might dissolve right through the container if it's the kind of plastic that can't handle it. So if you're not sure what you should use, just use glass so that you're on a safe side and you don't end up with a mess. And now we put it away and wait. I let it sit for a little over 24 hours. And I only did 24 hours because I was impatient. If my friend approves of these and wants me to make a bunch, I plan on dunking them and leaving them in there for like 3 days or more. So then the oil can really get in there. Then I took them out, wiped off the excess, and let them dry. This is the longest part of the process. Because the oil is so deep in the wood, you really have to be patient and give it time. I let these sit for a week. That's one of the reasons tung oil isn't as popular to work with and hardware stores tend to lean towards carrying tung oil finish instead. This just takes so long to dry, but I personally feel like it's so worth it, especially if you're working with things that are going to be coming into contact with food. So I honestly don't mind the wait. This is it, the final product. I'm actually surprised that I didn't need to sand them down at all after they dried. The oil absorbed really well, and what was left on the surface didn't create any additional texture, so I didn't have to do any additional work. My friend said that my handmade spoon looks like something that a hobbit would use in the Shire, so from now on I'll be calling this my hobbit spoon. I don't hate it. It has personality. But this is definitely something that I'll only be making as a one-off. Never if I need to make more than one at a time. It's just way too much work and it's not worth it. And now I have the CNC file, so even less of a reason to do it by hand. The CNC ones came out as clear winners though. My friend said that she really likes them, so I guess they got the necessary seal of approval. So I'll be making her about 20 of these for the first round. I don't know, that feels like a good number. And I'm also happy with how they turned out. To this day, African mahogany and tung oil is my favorite combination ever. This wood has such a beautiful shine that the oil brings out. I just can't stop looking at it. I am curious to hear what you guys think though. Does everybody prefer the CNC'd one? I feel like they're clear winners, but I don't know. Sometimes people really like that rustic look where you can clearly tell it was handmade. So, I don't know. I'd like to find out. Let me know. But that's it. I took my hobbit spoon home and will be using it for my coffee beans. I think the colors complement each other really well, so this will look great sitting on my counter. And I can finally throw out this blue plastic spoon that I've been using for the last year. That's it. I'm done. I made a spoon. I figured out how I'm going to make these in bulk. Let me know what your thoughts are and if you would do anything differently. And I'll see you guys next time. Bye.